Okay, welcome to week 8. Let's talk about technology and language and look especially at social norms in emailing and texting. That's what we're going to do this week. What we find is that when we communicate using technology, such as messaging or email, any computer mediated speech, what we find is that there are some expectations for how we're supposed to communicate in those environments, just as there are expectations for how we are supposed to communicate in a face-to-face context. So let's talk about those norms today. Before we look at technology, though, let's think about general face-to-face conversations that we have. So I'm going to now look at American compliments, or compliments in American English. So maybe you want to tell someone you like their new haircut, or that they look like they've lost weight, or that they did a good job on a presentation. These are the type of compliments that we give to each other. And there are 3 different types of compliment topics that we center our compliments around. So the first one is on appearance or possessions. I gave the example of, I like your new haircut, or you look like you've lost weight. 2/3 of those compliments, we're going to use the words nice, good, pretty, great, or beautiful when we're giving that compliment. And 90% of the time when we make an appearance or possession-based compliment, we're going to use the word like or love when we give that compliment. So it's really interesting. And now that I've said that, you're going to start hearing it when you give a compliment. The second type of compliment category is that we also compliment performances or skills and abilities. So you did a great job on that presentation. You're a wonderful writer. So that's a second type of compliment topic. And the last type is a compliment of a personality trait. So you're so sweet, or I love how outgoing you are. This type of compliment is less frequent than the other performance, skills, abilities type, and the appearance, possession types. So another interesting thing about compliments, in addition to the fact that there are certain lexical choices we make, such as using like and love, and that those are very conventionalized words we use when making a compliment, so another interesting thing is the syntactic structures of compliments that we use when complimenting. So there are grammatical structures that we expect to occur in certain types of compliments. A structure like noun phrase, is or looks, adjective, right? So those are terms, noun phrase, adjectives, probably ringing a bell from middle school. But let's look at that in a real example. Your blouse, that's a noun phrase, is or looks, then we have really in parentheses, and in linguistics when we put parentheses we use it to mean optional. So this sentence could read, your blouse looks beautiful. So your blouse is the noun phrase. Is, looks, really, adjective, beautiful. And so that's a typical structure on an appearance or possession compliment. Additionally, like I like, love, noun phrase, your car. We expect compliments to be put together in a certain order, and this is what we call syntactics in linguistics. But we have very conventionalized ways of complimenting each other. There's not a lot of new compliments, new compliment structures that are being produced in English. We might compliment different things like the new iPhone, but the structure of how we compliment someone's possessions or something about someone is very conventionalized. We're just maybe changing out what the noun is. So the investigation of compliments doesn't stop there. It's not just about giving the compliment. So not only do we have expectations for how compliments are stated or given, we have expectations on the types of responses one must give when they receive a compliment. So when someone pays you a compliment, you typically follow one of 4 options in how you respond to it. And as you're going through the week, I want you to think about these 4 and think about how first, I'm right, you will choose one of these 4 methods, and secondly, which one do you usually gravitate towards? So let's look at those 4 options. The first one is when we receive a compliment, we can accept it. So I really love that blouse on you. Thank you. I love it too. So we've accepted the compliment at that point. We acknowledge they're correct in this compliment, and I accept their assertion that this is a good thing, and I acknowledge it as well that I agree with their opinion. So that's one response type to a compliment. The second would be to mitigate it. Oh, I really love your blouse. Oh, this whole thing, yeah, I haven't worn it in forever. So we're downplaying the compliment. We acknowledge that we received one, but we're not looking too aggressive in a sense that we we equally value the blouse as much as that person has put value on it. You're trying to downplay it. We can also then, a third option would be when you get a compliment is to completely reject it. So I hear this one a lot when you talk about someone's physical appearance in terms of weight. You look like you've lost weight. And people respond with, oh gosh, no, I just feel so fat. We completely reject the compliment. As a type of mitigation, but it's full out rejection that we disagree with what they said. Thank you for the compliment, but I disagree. And the fourth thing we can give is just literally no response at all. And this one's interesting, the no response at all, because we do it on occasions, but it's very select occasions in which no response at all is the appropriate response. So of these four options, mitigation is by far the most common. Accepting the compliment but downplaying it like, oh, I'm not that great. Thank you, but I'm not that great. Followed by the second thing we usually do in linguistics, or when we compliment response, is reject it completely. Acceptance, our first response type, is usually more of an unnatural or an unlikely response. For you to compliment someone and then respond with, I agree, I am awesome. We tend to avoid this one just out of general social norms. We do it out of politeness and humbleness in a sense. We're not expected to agree or think highly of ourselves. So typically we don't use the acceptance one unless we're with close friends or people that we're really close with, in which case that usually is a little more socially appropriate. But the interesting thing about compliments and compliment responses is that they're very conventionalized. There's very specific ways we give compliments, and there's very specific ways we respond to those compliments. And you're not really taught these strategies. To some extent, yeah, as a parent, I'm, reminding my child, say, to tell someone, well, tell them they look nice today. So I'm telling them they need to give the compliment, or if someone compliments them, I'm like, well, say thank you. Or, I'm kind of instructing them on at what times in social exchange we need to put in compliments or respond to them. But the strategies we use to compliment or respond to compliments, it's just something we innately pick up on. We start seeing the way it works in our society, and we see, okay, compliments always look like this and responses always look like this. So they've become very, what we call routinized, or conventionalized. They're the same script over and over again, but they work. A very conventionalized compliment is still seen as a compliment. It's still valuable. But it's really interesting, the whole compliment game we play. But now we want to talk about what this has to do with communicating in the realm of technology. So let's take a look at how this applies to email. In email, when you're not face-to-face with someone, there are still norms that are going to be accepted and some unwritten rules in place that you are expected to follow. Some of those rules are like, do not type in all caps. And one of the reasons why you wouldn't do that is because when you receive an email and someone's typed in all caps, you instinctively think, oh, this person sounds mad, right? So we know typically you shouldn't type in all caps. Another norm for emails would be that you fill out the subject line. And in the subject line, it should be concise and an appropriate summary of what the email entails, but you should fill in the subject line. So here's a list of typical things, typical norms we expect in email, and we typically follow these things. We're not typically taught all of these conventions. Some of them we might be taught, like we maybe took a computer class in high school and they taught us how to send an email. But a lot of these things we mainly learn by seeing these conventions being used by other people. So kind of like how compliments work. We witness how compliments work in society, and we see what appropriate compliment responses are. And so we then gauge, okay, this is a normal compliment, this is a norm for complimenting, this is a norm for responding to a compliment. We take on norms in terms of email communication the same way. We live it and we witness it, so we begin to model these conventions in our own language. But then now we want to talk about texting, right? And so there are norms for texting, just like there are norms for compliments and just like there are norms for emails. But what are the norms, and are we supposed to use them or not? That's the question, right? So these two memes my colleague found are awesome because they definitely indicate that people are aware of texting norms and have strong opinions about them. I love these memes. So 99% of all LOLs are said with a face like this. So funny. The idea that we use LOL all the time to indicate we are laughing, but in reality, it's not a good measure of if we're actually laughing out loud or not. The norm then is that you use LOL regardless of whether or not you are actually laughing out loud. So that would be a type of norm in texting. The second meme, you can't text me back, but you can like 8 photos on Instagram. So this indicates a norm that in texting, as well as an email, you are expected to respond pretty quickly, almost as if texting carries the same norm that a face-to-face conversation would expect. So if we're out having a face-to-face conversation and I say something to you, for you to delay responding for X amount of time would be rude, right? The normal thing to do when someone's talking to you is to respond. So in a way, texting carries that same conversational norm of, even if you're in another state, but I'm texting you, you should respond quickly as if we're having a face-to-face conversation. So it's a really interesting part of texting that's carried with it. And like I said, email pretty much has the same thing depending on its use. So I know, like in an office setting, if I'm getting emailed by my colleague who's the next office over and she knows I'm in my office, she's expecting me to respond quickly. Versus if I'm emailed by someone across campus, I have more time to respond because for as much as they know, I'm not even in the office that day. But we do have norms and expectations of how quickly someone should respond given the context and the context of the conversation and the mode of communication. So this next meme is really awesome. Also, it says, honestly, it's not the way I look that reveals my age. It's my use of complete sentences when I text. And actually, texting using full sentence with proper punctuation is considered marked speech in texting. And real quick, I keep throwing around the word marked in various lectures, so let me redefine that for you. Marked speech is when we use a variant of a word in a situation when one variant is more dominant, or when one type of word is more dominant. So weeks ago we talked about sociolex, and then when we talked about Lebov's study, and we talked about the use of R or not having a strong R when we speak. And in that same lecture we talked about the ing sound, so ing, with words like running, singing, jumping, and how a marked variant of that would be running, singing, jumping. And I said at that point that young men typically used more marked variants than other people, right? So marked in that case, marked variants, where they were using a type of the word that was less used than another type. So using running instead of running. So in this case, with text messaging, using proper punctuation and full sentences is a marked variant, is marked language compared to what people typically do in texting, which is they truncate their speech and they omit words and they don't capitalize things that could be capitalized. So in texting, generally full sentences goes out the window, but typically you still probably see in older generations they use full sentences and correct punctuation when they communicate. So sometimes when you receive messages like that, you can assume that it is someone, possibly an older generation individual. The other instances in which I use punctuation and standard written styles of English when I text is if I'm texting somebody for work. So, or let's say I'm texting you as a student, I'm not going to get super or use my most all my text ease or texting abilities when I'm talking to you professionally as your professor, because the context of that communication should be professional, right? Student to professor, or when I used to recruit for colleges, recruiter to prospective student. I'm going to use a more standard writing style as I would in an email just because of the relationship. But generally in text messages, we can get very abrupt and abbreviated. So also with punctuation, if we look at the second meme, sometimes punctuation, even though we don't use it in the standard writing way in text, it can also mean a lot in texting. So for example, if you look at the example of okay in this meme, you can see that different punctuations and have different meanings here. So it's not that we don't use punctuation in texting, we just don't use it the same way we would in a formal writing context. Now these norms for texting, one of them is going to be abbreviating text, right? So not necessarily using proper English in our texting. I gave the example last week of through and through. So we've got the standard spelling of THROUGH and the abbreviated spelling of THRU. Let's see here. So we have some people who believe that by constantly breaking the writing rules in texting, so constantly using THRU, that this habit in texting is going to bleed over into our general use of these terms in a formal writing setting. So starting for me to start saying THRU in a student's formal essay rather than the full standard word THROUGH. So that's the question we're addressing this week. We're going to explore, we're going to look at the evidence that talks about whether or not all this texting all these texting norms, whether or not they actually bleed into the other ways, the other contexts and platforms in which we use, especially written English. So you're going to evaluate the evidence this week and give me your own point of view with letting me know if you think texting is therefore hurting or helping our communication and other platforms. I look forward to hearing your responses. Take care.